Stat 5.1. Sampling methods. All right, so we have a lot of understanding of talking about. So first off, we have the population, some things that we talked about in our do now, and I'm going to put in parentheses because sometimes we say the population of interest. Sometimes we'll just say the population. So the population of interest is the entire group of who we are interested in knowing the information about in a study. Okay, so who is everyone that we are interested in? So as you saw in the do now, when we talked about it was every American, it was everybody who visits a bar, it was every car that's driving on the road. Technically we said all cars, and all I think about it's all cars that are driving, that are on the road, that are any road, right? Because they don't care about cars that are not driving. Then we learned about sampling frame. Sampling frame is the group within a population that has the potential to be included. Again, potential to be included in the study. Could be, ideally, I'm going to put ideally is the same as the population. So I'm going to let you catch up and write this because I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to give you an anecdote of why this is also very important. We saw some in our do now, but here's another very important one. In your history class, I'm sure at some point in your history classes, you've seen and you studied presidents and you studied elections. One of the most famous ones was Truman sitting on top of a car during the Great Depression, or I think it was Franklin D. Roosevelt. I think it was Franklin Roosevelt. And he's holding a newspaper article over his head, and it says, Dewey wins presidency. Dewey wins elected new president of the United States. Now, do you remember President Dewey? President Dewey? Yeah. Exactly. He didn't win the election. He lost. He lost to the Democratic Roosevelt, who actually won in a landslide. And it said Dewey wins in a landslide. It actually was the other way around. And the reason was because there was a very poor sampling frame. The way they used to figure out who won the presidency was they would do survey studies beforehand as the people exited. However, during the Great Depression, what they did is they called people on their phone, the landline, they called them on the phone, and then they recorded who they were voting for. So they got all of these people to answer the question by answering their phone and answering that question. Well, wait a minute. It's the Great Depression. Everybody's poor. Does everybody have a phone? Does everybody have a phone during that era, during that time? No. So what happened was the sampling frame was only those individuals who had a phone. And those people who have phones were much, much more likely, ideally. So that's a parenthesis and then ideally. So the sampling frame was only people who were on their phone, which were heavily Republican, which were heavily in favor of Dewey, the Republican person that was up for election. They did not ask. Most of the people who did vote were the people who were poor, the people who didn't have phone, who didn't have a chance to be included in the survey. And they were the ones who voted Roosevelt into the presidency. And it was one of the prime examples of a poor sampling frame that they did a good job of trying to take a sample. They did a random phone calls to people, but because they only selected people who have their phones, that was bad. Another example, how many people like lunch? I'm going to stand out in front of the lunch and randomly try to ask people at the cafeteria, do you like the lunch? Well, if you go to the cafeteria, you might like lunch a little bit more, right? So sampling frame. Then we get the sample. The sample is the part of the group that is selected to be in the study. Now, this is what a lot of you are referring to as a sample and are do now. Those people who are selected, that's called the sample, different than the sampling frame. Every 10th person or whatever. Those people who are selected is the sample. And that's who that's when we do studies, when we do our data, we're going to be using a sample. So don't worry, that math that we've been doing, normal model stuff, is going to come back. But before we go back to that normal model stuff, we need to know how do we collect data. It is shown that most of the data, most of the statistics that goes wrong is not in the math. It's in how the data is collected. If you go to trials and jury selections and all, I know, like a crime scene, they don't try to pick apart the math. They pick apart how the data was collected. Did they do that process correctly? So here's a visual for you. So let's assume this whole thing is my population. This box represents everybody that I am interested in learning about. This box represents all cars. This box represents all RBA students. Okay? I'm going to do a survey, and I'm going to give the questions about how important is attending school on time. This right here represents the sample frame, the sampling frame. The sampling frame comes from the population, but doesn't include the entire population. This is the people who could be in the study. Okay? And finally, these dots here, these represent the individuals that are actually in the sample. Now, you can only be in the sample if you're part of the sampling frame. If you are an individual who doesn't show up to school on time, and this represents you out here, you have no choice, no chance to be part of the sample. Which means that's then the data analysis, that means it's very bad. If you're only asking students, is school important to you, and you ask them only first period, well, I think you're going to get very good favors about how important school is because they're here first period. If you ask those people who didn't respond or who didn't be part of it, they would have said something greatly different. And we'll talk about why they're good versus bad later on. But sampling methods. Let's first talk about the bad. All right? Bad methods of sampling. Number one, the first bad method of sampling is what is called a convenience sample. What do you think about when you hear convenience sample? What do you think that is? If you heard convenience sample, how do you think that sample is taken? In a convenient way. Convenience. I'm missing like an extra EN. Convenience, there it goes, an extra E-N-C-E. So it's it's a simple sample. It's a sample with little effort taken to select who is included. Often a poor sampling frame. If you only give a survey and you only ask your friends, do you think we should go da 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 da? What do you think the response is going to be? Are they going to be very different responses from your friends? Most likely all your friends are going to probably say the same type of thing. You're not going to really get a, should we go and do this thing that you probably shouldn't do? They're all going to probably be, yeah, let's go do it, dude. Because that's a poor sample. That's a convenient sample. Again, first period. Number 2, a voluntary response sample. A voluntary response sample is a sample where individuals self-include themselves into the study. So you decide if you want to be part of it. You decide. Now, the reason why this is bad is because it is often only extreme views included. At the recent PTA meeting, Parent-Teacher Association meeting, it was found that parents, well, wait a minute. It's not that all parents. It's only those people who showed up to the PTA. And if you show up to a PTA after-school meeting, it means you probably feel very strongly for or very strongly against a topic. So a voluntary response, so only people who click the link to go onto the website. Remember the part about the website from problem 1? In order to be in the study, you had to visit the site. You selected to be into the survey. You weren't selected to be part of the survey, the study. You self-included yourself. That's called a voluntary response sample. Number 3, a judgment sample. A judgment sample is a sample where a person attempts to get a sample they feel represents the population. Okay? A sample where a person attempts to, if that was the case, probably not. If the class is like 80% males, should half the sample be male and half the sample be female? Probably not. And this is what happens with a judgment sample. We are inherently means like without realizing you're doing it. Yes, without knowing, we are biased.
So write in those words if you don't know what inherently means. Without knowing, we are biased.
Yes. All right.
So right here. Yeah, so that's learned bias is like stuff you don't realize it is. Like you might not realize you're judging someone based on like the way you were raised because you just like that's how you
and because of timing, I'm just not going to be able to finish it. We're going to have to, on Monday, we're going to have to do notes. We're going to have to finish these notes on Monday because we just don't have enough time. We did a little bit longer, which was good. It was good for you. You guys were very active in attempting to do now, which I think is going to help you in the long run. So there are 4 more sample methods that we're going to talk about, but we're going to have to cover that in the beginning of class, and then we'll go into the do now and homework. Okay, I just don't have it, we just ran.